Hi again. Today we are going to go into chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 covers the issue of laws and ethics in providing the security solution in protecting your security asset. So, why are these two issues need further understanding by you as future solution provider in security mechanism? Of course, first of all, we need to look at the definition and what is the distinct difference between these two factors. First of all, the distinct difference between ethics and laws is that ethics are actually socially acceptable behavior that we have come accustomed to even from our childhood. What is right or wrong is dependent on what we have grown accustomed to from our community or perhaps from our social upbringing. On the other hand, we have law. Now, law is usually defined by what is written and can be enforced in a written or perhaps based on the judicial system. And actually, although sometimes law can be describing something of right or wrong that we can or cannot do, but sometimes what is ethically acceptable cannot be enforced by law. For example, simply put, okay, we cannot swear in terms of ethics. We cannot talk bad about a person. But in terms of law, that thing cannot be enforced because it is not properly written in the bylaw to actually indicate that we cannot actually talk bad about a person unless it involves certain special individual. So that is just one example of the difference between what is ethical and perhaps what is by and can be enforced by law. And now we delve further into the difference between policy and law. Perhaps you have heard before that we have certain company policy, meaning that it guides the what is acceptable behavior within a company in terms of protecting or perhaps how to actually do something in an organization. Okay, so usually policies contain guidelines that describe acceptable or unacceptable behavior of the employee or perhaps the client. And then we also have certain penalties if certain policies is not being followed by the people that is involved and written in the policy. So what is the difference between policy and law? So usually if let's say outside the company, okay, if you don't actually follow this written policy and sometimes it is dismissible or is acceptable, okay, and ignorance of the policy is acceptable but ignorance of law is unacceptable because law carries a much more weight in the community or in the governing body compared to the company policy. So why is this important actually? Okay, because okay, let's say you are writing a policy for password guideline or how to actually people protect their personal information within the company. So how do you go about this to make sure that your people in your organization actually follows the policy that you have written to actually protect that confidential information? So this is where you must actually be much more smarter in planning for your policy. And at the same time, it can actually integrate with the existing law. For example, you are writing a policy of personal information, but perhaps you can actually follow the guideline of PDPA or personal distribution of personal information. So, by having the law that is instilled or interweave with your policy, you can ensure that people can easily follow. And let's say people don't follow that policy, okay, they can be punishable by the existing law. Okay, so this is actually your first guideline to how to actually write your own policy to actually protect your security asset. And at the same time, you must remember the key to actually enforce a policy or make it understood by the people involved is, first of all, you must make sure that, first of all, it is disseminated properly. Disseminate properly means that it reach the correct people that you are intended it to be. So for example, you are writing the policy for your employee, so you must make sure that you have properly distribute, perhaps in terms of leaflet or pamphlet, or perhaps you give talk about the policy that people need to actually follow. And secondly, you must actually review the policy to make sure that it is understood by the target audience. Okay, if you write too complex of a sentence or perhaps information, perhaps it cannot reach your target audience very well. So if your policy is not properly understood, it cannot be properly followed and enforced. Third, of course, based on that, if you properly review it, then you can have proper comprehension. People can easily understand and can easily follow what you need to do based on the policy that you are writing. So comprehension is very important. That's why, okay, in our previous exercise, you need to identify your target or your people, because you are writing your policy to your people, to your specific target audience. So when you know who you are writing the policy for, then you can actually tailor-make the policy that you are writing based on their level of understanding. And then of course, you need to make sure that it is compliance to a certain standard. Compliance means that, okay, let's say you find existing law in terms of personal data protection. Okay, so when you are writing your policy for personal data protection based on existing PDPA law, okay, then you have certain compliance and you can actually enforce if, let's say, some wrongdoing happen. And lastly, you must have uniform enforcement. This is to ensure that, okay, if let's say something wrongdoing or certain things actually against the policy that you are writing, then you can actually do certain penalty or certain action. Okay, and then this must be ensured that all people that involved is treated equally, whether which level of people in your organization that actually do the thing that is against the policy. Okay, so that is where you have to properly differentiate between policy and law, because policy are written specifically within your organization, but it is best if your written policy is based on existing law to support and help you to enforce the policy. Now we look at cyber law. So why is cyber law understanding important? Because of course you are actually cybersecurity student and you are studying cybersecurity subject, so of course you need to differentiate between physical law and cyber law. This is also important because one of the key security control, okay, aside from hardware or software control, is the properly written policy. So when you are writing a policy, understanding the difference between law and cyber law is also very important. Because remember previously, if you want to ensure that your policy can be enforced, one of the key factors is that it has certain compliance with the law or standard. First of all, regardless of formal definition, whatever terms cyber means, that it always refers to what is happening within the network of interconnected computers. Okay, so when you talk about cyber law, it must cover whatever action or perhaps any event that happen within this network of computers. So when we talk about cybercrime, it's actually any crime that is committed over this network or the internet. So any wrongdoing, any perhaps misuse of information, any illegal action within the constraint of the internet or the connected computers, hardware and software, and even the people involved is considered a cybercrime. Okay, so what is illegal happening in the physical world, and if it's, let's say, happen through the cyber world or the internet, then it is considered a cybercrime. Okay, so based on this definition, any crime, any illegal act, anything that involving the software, the people, or perhaps the information there is considered a cybercrime. So these are just some of the examples of the types of cybercrime that perhaps you already accustomed or heard of. Okay, of course, you have learned about it in cybersecurity subjects or perhaps in network penetration or in computer forensics, but this is just a recap of what types of cybercrime that is out there that you perhaps can read again about it. So you can look at unauthorized access and penetration of information. You can also look at theft of proprietary information or copyrighted material and financial fraud, followed by sabotage, of course, disruption of network, or computer virus creation or malware, and intellectual property piracy, and identity theft, and of course, lastly, is terrorism. So these are acts that is performed over the internet that involve the information and the people that is there using that information. So anything within this category are considered cybercrime. So, by definition, when you have cybercrime, of course, we need to have cyber law to protect the people, the information, the asset that we have on this cyberspace. So, it refers to any legal and regulatory aspect of the internet or any enforcement that we can do in order to protect our information asset on the internet and also the cyberspace. So, in terms of having a cyber law in Malaysia, so we have two distinct objectives. First of all, we need to ensure that there is an enabling law to actually enforce and protect every people or every transaction that they are doing in the cyberspace. And then of course, secondly, to create the right development and of the communication and multimedia industry to make sure that whenever people are using it, they are safe and protected, and this will enrich further use and development of this infrastructure. So these are the two major objectives of the cyber law in Malaysia. So aside from that cyber law, we also need to understand there are two types of punishable law. So first of all, there are civil law. So this is actually relate to anything between that is happening between individuals and organization. That is civil law. Secondly, we have criminal law. So this actually covers violation of harmful to society and actively enforced and prosecuted by the state. Okay, so there's two differences here. Civil law between individual and organization, and then the criminal law is actually what is harmful to the society. So there will be exercises for you to actually be able to differentiate between civil law and criminal law. Of course, you are future cybersecurity uh, authority or perhaps the one that is writing the policy to protect your client and perhaps your people. So understanding between the criminal law and cyber law and also civil law is very important for you to understand what can be enforced and what can help you to actually enforce and write them properly in your policy to protect your information asset. Okay, so how to actually properly differentiate between civil law and criminal law? So here's the tips. Okay, for example, I've given you here, for civil law, for example, you are stealing a movie from Baba Boy or Upin Ipin, for example, and you distribute it over Facebook or social media. Okay, so when you are stealing a copyrighted material from an organization or a creative body, for example, so this is actually considered a civil law crime. Okay, so what is happening to you is that it must be between you and the company that you stole from. So this is actually a civil law. So that company must actually provide evidence that you actually stole their property and what type of property that you have stolen, for example, and when does it happen. Okay, so everything there must be provided by that company that actually try to accuse and perhaps bring you to the law to be punished. While a criminal law, What is covered under criminal law? Okay, let's say someone killed a person. Okay, that is considered as something that's harmful to the community. So this one is covered under criminal law. So any criminal law is covered or actually handled by the government. So you have a proper law proceeding that is handled on a state level or perhaps district level. Okay, let's say for example also burglary, okay, drunk driving for example, those are criminal law. It is between you and the community, although it happens between individuals, but actually causing harm to another person is covered under criminal law. But if you are actually doing something wrong to an organization, that is covered under civil law. Clear enough? Good. And then moving further ahead, you have also public law and private law. So basically, criminal law is covered under public law because it involves the public and the community. So it involves sometimes international law, administrative law, constitution, criminal, and of course, tax law. And on the other hand, you have private law, means that the law that is covering any contract, for example, or family law, employment, land law, or perhaps about wills and succession. Okay, this is just elaborate further on what types of law that is out there. But for now, just remember previously about civil law and the criminal law. Then you're good to go. Now, here's a question before you take your break. Okay, is DDoS considered or covered under civil law or criminal law? Is it considered a civil offense or criminal offense? So which will it be? So how do you justify a DDoS as perhaps civil law or DDoS as perhaps a criminal law? What are the situation and scenario to make it covered under civil law or criminal law? Okay, so discuss perhaps with your friend or perhaps with me later on after the lecture. Okay, so think about it before or while you are going on your 5-minute break. Alright, so before we go further, you can take the 5-minute break and then we continue. So part 3 covers some of the examples of Malaysia and international cyber law. So in terms of Malaysian cyber law, these are some of the law that you can actually look for reference if you are writing your policy or certain guideline on how or what law is actually covered or can be punishable under the Malaysian cyber law. So you can look at the Corporate Amendment, you can look at Computer Crimes Act, and of course digital signature, telemedicine, of course the Communication and Multimedia Act, Electronic Commerce Act, and also PDPA, Penal Code, and Anti-Fake News. So these are actually covered and can be enforced if certain wrongdoing happen. Because nowadays, of course, people are connected over the internet, and of course, certain or some cybercrime is prone to happen. So it's good if you actually know what laws can you actually use or write your policy that it can be enforced and can protect your information asset. Apart from that, you also need to understand the coverage of international laws and also legal bodies. Because sometimes whatever is could be enforced in Malaysia is not covered by international law. So let's say your criminal is actually residing in another country. So how do you actually bring about this criminal to ensure that that can be punishable by Malaysian law? So this is actually very hard to do because of course you perhaps have read or read about it. Okay, so usually if a crime is happening outside Malaysia, this is particularly relevant in terms of cybercrime. So it's hard for actually Malaysian enforcement or Malaysian official to actually bring about these perpetrators and punish them by Malaysian law. Because first of all, based on geographical boundary, and of course, because our laws cannot actually punish what people of the outside of Malaysia are actually doing. So sometimes it requires certain internetworking with the bodies outside Malaysia, and sometimes we need to actually have those people be captured overseas and then bring them into Malaysia. But usually it is very hard to do. So sometimes you need to be very realistic, okay, in terms of what can be enforced, okay, and what can you do. So by understanding this boundary, you can actually expect, okay, remember the proactive and reactive mechanism of your perhaps your policy or your security mechanism. So you need to understand what can you actually do in terms of protecting to ensure that no outside interruption or threat can actually harm your information asset that you want to protect. So understanding who are you actually need to handle or need to anticipate that can attack your information asset is very important from the very beginning, because although you have written a proper policy or it follows certain laws, but laws also have limitation. So understanding that from the very beginning is also very important. And of course, understanding the limitation is to understand also what help or assistance can be provided by the international body. Usually in terms of extradition process, meaning to extradite, okay, the criminal that is outside in order to bring them back to our country. So what are the processes? And can it be done or not? What are the constraints? These are the questions that you need to ask, okay? And sometimes it's good for you to actually read on existing incident or existing case reference to know that what are the existing limitation to actually punish certain criminal that is actually residing outside the geographical location of our country. So the following there are general computer crime laws that you can use as reference. Remember, only use those as reference because it only covers the United States region. Okay, so those that you can look for is of course concerning the computer fraud law and also the information infrastructure. And then the one that is frequently being heard over there is the Patriot Act and its improvement. And of course, lastly, the Computer Security Act of 1987. But of course, we have our own equivalent here based on Malaysian cyber law. But it's good to actually write or read about what is actually happening or what it can be enforced overseas to know that what are the boundaries and what can be covered or where can we work together in case there is something happening, okay, that is involving perhaps international criminal. Okay, so it's important for you to know this information or read about it if you are writing the policy to actually protect your information asset later on, perhaps in the future. Of course, one thing that you need to understand or perhaps remind yourself is that technology is always evolving. So some laws that perhaps is outdated need to always be revised later on. So perhaps if you are in the government next time, okay, you can be reminded that these laws need always to be revised and look upon further or improve further because technology is always evolving. So what is covered by perhaps technology in the 80s or 90s cannot be actually covered by laws, okay, of that current era. It needs to always updated because the media is always changing and evolving. So remember that in the old days, all of us does not actually have certain recording media, for example. But nowadays, all of us have a recording capability even with our small smartphone or handphones. So that coverage or evolving of technology need to be considered when you are writing a policy and also law to ensure that certain law can be enforced and those law can actually protect the people, okay, and also your information asset. That it was or what is the focus of the law that you are writing or the policy that you want to enforce. Remember, this thing evolve, it changes over time, so your policy must always remember it must be proactive. Okay, you must anticipate things before they happen So if certain things happen, does your policy or law actually cover or could react to those situations that could happen? Okay, this is a reminder to yourself because you are the future of information enforcer or perhaps the policy writer later on. So remember that. So among the normal cybercrime that is happening in Malaysian environment, for example, are those above that. So usually it involves email abuse, identity theft, forgery, and also the most common one is e-commerce cheating because nowadays people are actually actively performing in the transaction, let's say on Shopee, on Instagram, on Facebook, for example. So even though there are certain warnings or perhaps certain guideline, people still are prone to this, to be the victim of this type of crime. And of course, telecommunication line theft. Usually, telecommunication line theft is involving those in the industrial sector because sometimes people want to evade payment because they are actually using high volume of telephone line for their business, and some shady business even use this method to actually evade from actually paying the officials. So these are just an example of the common computer related crime in Malaysia. So in a nutshell, the benefit of having a proper cyber law and you properly enforce and act upon it is that people feel safe with the system. So whatever transaction is being done is actually trustworthy, and perhaps people can trust the system, and business within the cyberspace there can be trusted and be properly used by the people that we are targeting. Because nowadays, okay, for example, we have during the CEO condition where people cannot go out. So because we have a proper system to protect the users, that's why most people are comfortable using or actually providing business over the internet, and people in general trust the system because in general the system works and there are proper enforcement and people trust the system. So when we have trust of the system, so business and any transaction within the environment can be trusted and bloom further. And of course, when people trust the governing body, so there can actually be certain improvement and there can be policy further that can be enforced to actually further protect the people and perhaps improve the system in general. So remember, the key here is that if you have written the policy, written the law, make sure it is properly implemented, and whatever wrongdoing happen, it is swift and people believe that they are protected within the boundaries of that law and system. So this ends part 3. So before we move on further to part 4, okay, please take a 5-minute break and recap what we have learned in part 3, which is on the cyber law and the importance of the cyber law to be properly enforced and what type of cyber law can be used as reference. So part 4, we are going to look at the actual crime and crime motivation within the realms of cyberspace. Now, it's important for you to properly have the ability to categorize the difference between this type of computer crime. So there are 3 types of computer crime, beginning from the computer assisted crime, which is that the crime is being assisted by a computer tools. So it can be assisted by perhaps your mobile phone, your laptop, or even your personal computer, meaning the crime is being performed on these devices. Secondly, you have computer-specific or targeted crime. So here, the target of the crime is the device. Alright, so here it can be a banking system, it can be perhaps a user's mobile phone, for example, is the target of the crime. So that is the second category. The third one is a bit tricky, where the computer is incidental. It's not a tool, it's not the target, but perhaps it's there, and perhaps is involved in the crossfire of the actual crime. So perhaps during theft, okay, a computer is incidentally be part of the thing that is stolen. Or perhaps when entering a building, a computer is perhaps incidentally being used as a tool by the criminal. But it is not a main tool, but perhaps is there to assist further on the crime. Okay, so these three categories can either be together, or it can also be independent of each other. It is important for you to differentiate between these three, perhaps in terms of enforcing which law, or understanding how did the crime actually happen, or how could a certain incident happen. Okay, because you are actually planning to protect your asset, so you need to understand how can a certain threat or a threat agent use computer, or perhaps targeting a certain computer, okay, that can harm your information asset. So understand and properly differentiate between these three types of computer crime. In terms of today's cybercrime, you need to look at it in three different aspects. So first of all, it sometimes involves serious criminal. So this type of criminal usually is more organized, it is properly planned, and it's rarely a individual task or perhaps planning. So usually you have a group of people that have certain motivation, or perhaps monetary gain or motivation, okay, and they are knowledgeable, and of course they are properly organized. So usually they have one people that understand, okay, they need a proper team to actually perform this. And of course, any crime involve proper planning, as you are also planning for actually to protect your asset. You must understand that on the other side there are also other people or your threat that is also planning to actually infiltrate your defenses and steal your information asset. Okay, it's not just like the action is performed overnight. Usually the task is carefully planned, okay, either to identify the target, to identify possible loophole, possible vulnerability. So they need to also study the target. So you need to understand this, that your threat agent is also properly trained and have the capability to properly plan for their action. And then of course there is the motivation. Okay, aside from greed, the obvious one, sometimes it's because of revenge, because perhaps some ex-employee have something that they are not properly settled with the company that they leave. Okay, perhaps they are fired from the company, okay, and perhaps they need to prove something to a certain organization. So this is involving ego. So there are certain motivation. Okay, sometimes it isn't very clear. And then lastly, the method. So nowadays, the method can be from anywhere, because people can actually outsource this expert. Even they are not properly linked to the team, people can actually employ certain expert or hackers to perform the task for them. So remember the boundaries of the law. So because sometimes people understand that there is a certain restriction in terms of uh, bringing the people to justice from perhaps overseas, so sometimes they employ people from the overseas. So this can be one of the challenges. So based on this understanding, you need to actually anticipate where can the threat come from, okay, how can they be exploited, okay, how can you properly plan for your security control. This is the most important essence of understanding what cybercrime is out there, and what are your limitations, and what can you expect further to protect your information asset. Okay, remember, you must be proactive, and you must be able to react to certain situation if it happens. So based on your understanding, you need to understand that today's crime or cybercrime is more sophisticated. Okay, because crime can be committed over the internet. So regardless of boundaries, it can be performed from other side of the world to actually infect other parts of the world. And of course, cyber terrorism and money laundering. So let's say you are actually using certain business as a front, but at the background, that money comes from an illegal activity. And then the fourth one, because hacking skills nowadays can be obtained over the internet, and that skill can actually be sold and provide as a service. Okay, so some people does not care actually who or what organization are they providing the services for, as long as they are paid or rewarded. And then of course, as a form of economic sabotage, sometimes you have two rival company, so they can employ certain experts or certain agent to perform that act on their behalf, and at the same time be anonymous. So these are the dangers that you need to understand based on today's current scenario and the capability of the technology that is there, that can be utilized by both you and also what you are protecting it against. Also, it's good for you to understand the nature and characteristic of cybercrime, because nowadays anything can be performed over the internet, so the perpetrators or the criminal can have the capability to be anonymous, and they have an enormous range, meaning within outside the boundaries of geographical location. And then thirdly, it can happen very fast, cross border, and of course have multiple impact depending on how big the crime is. And of course, it is technology oriented and supported, because nowadays people have these gadgets and have this capability to actually perform this crime, okay, using those technology. And then of course, usually the age group of the criminal or the ones that are doing the act of hacking can be ranged from 16 to 40 years old and above, because technology knows no boundary, and this knowledge is available to all for them to learn and also to use or misuse. So you need to understand this characteristic in order for you to properly plan and anticipate what crime or attacks could be fallen upon your information asset. So the following is just an example of the extent of criminal activities on cybercrime. Most of them you have probably heard of before, okay? Just you can read about it further, or you need perhaps categorize this type of crime that could be fallen in your or towards your information asset. So the motivation for those crimes, it can be anything, because it involves a wide range of age gap. So it can be beginning from a very young attacker to a very matured and perhaps seasoned attacker. So it can be as trivial as for just for fun motivation, or just a test of skill, or because they have the capability to be anonymous. So when people are anonymous, they tend to be much more braver, and perhaps they feel that they are free from being responsible from the action. And of course, the nature of the internet, because it's fast and immediate, whatever you do have immediate result and can be seen. And also, of course, easy money, because nowadays you can always provide your skills as a service, no matter what skills you have, and you can also actually be sold over the internet. And of course, it's trans-border. This is one of the motivation, because you will actually operate within the or outside the boundary of your law coverage. So people tend to be much more braver to actually perform this criminal act. So this can be the motivation aside from the monetary reward that is there for the attacker to actually be rewarded once they perform certain attacks. So remember, usually this attacker or the performer of the attack are sometimes third-party agents. They are hired based on their expertise and not because of their personal motivation towards the organization that they are attacking. So this is very important, because you need to understand who are the possible attacker that can actually perform this attack, where can they actually gain this type of attacker or experts, and how can you actually protect against this type of attack. because it's impossible for you to actually anticipate every attack that could come, but you can actually anticipate how can you actually protect your information against this type of attack. So you need to have perhaps proper backup aside from the obvious security mechanism that protect the data from being stolen, but you have to have proper backups at the same time should that data be stolen. So you need to have actual practice on anticipating and also reacting to certain condition that could happen. This is the key part, okay, in information security management. So after covering about law, now we look or investigate further on the importance of having proper ethics in protecting or providing a solution to protect your information asset. So what is the importance of ethics in information security? So as information security professionals of the future, we need to understand the role of ethics is not directly embedded in your policy, but it must be used as a whole environment or ecosystem where people operate to follow your policy. So this is why it's very important for when you are writing the policy, make sure that it also follows the community or social norm of the people within your organization. So when ethics and law and policy can be interweaved together, then you have a very good policy that can be understood and followed by your target audience. So this is the very important of the role of ethics in your policy and law enforcement. So when we talk about ethics as a whole, in terms of computer experts or person with a computer skills in terms of operating software, hardware, or even directly uh, using computer skills to actually manipulate or get information. So you must understand as information security professionals with that capability, it must come with a certain social responsibility and understanding. Okay, just like Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So use your skills for the greater good and not just offer your skills to any people that offer you monetary reward. So if you have hacking skill, for example, for the use of good, perhaps you can be a pen tester or a white hat hacker, for example. So use your skill to better benefit people and not to harm people. That is the key guideline here in the 10 commandments of computer ethics. And also, ethics is not exclusively cultural. Basically, everyone, okay, since you have grown up from perhaps little kids until you are adult, you have certain moral and ethical value that you follow. What is good and what is bad is very clear. Okay, although it cannot be enforced by law, but you understand that certain things must be done for the greater good of the people and the community. And basically, ethics can be found among every people, okay, within the same country, within the same social class, okay, within the same group of people. And we can understand what is good, what is bad very clearly without actually, usually our conscience will guide us. Okay, so key study reveal factors that overriding in the ethical perception within a small population is education. So where do we get this education about ethics? Usually from our parents, from our peers, and usually from the same community group of education. So usually these type of people share the same code and ethical value. Okay, so usually how is this actually beneficial to you as the information security manager? So this is where when you understand that this group of people have the same code of ethics as you because you are from the same community, for example, so you can actually weave your policy and your law to follow this group social norm and social ethics so that you can easily understand why certain thing needs to be done and why certain thing needs to be done, because it's good and it must be followed because it is ethical. So this is where you can properly use ethics to effectively write your policy and can be at the same time protected and enforced by law. Usually, ethical value have more push factor compared to the law enforcement. So if you can actually get a middle or interweaving between these two, then you can have a proper policy that can be followed by your target audience. When understanding this importance of ethics, so after that you can also use this to deter actually illegal and unethical acts. So let's say, for example, people actually leaking personal information that is considered as unethical. So you can properly write that as perhaps something that is against the policy and can be punishable by law. So it is important for you to make people understand through the use of properly written policy. After that, educate your target users what or how to follow that policy and have proper training and perhaps proper technological support to support that policy that you want to actually enforce. So perhaps in terms of protecting private information, you can have a proper policy in terms of you have properly written policy of conducting or safeguarding personal information of the customer, for example. And in terms of technology support, you have proper database tracking or audit trail to ensure that every people that is handling private information, for example, is properly recorded and the action can properly be tracked. So people can understand certain action is unethical and at the same time is supported by your hardware or software technology. Okay, so of course you need to also consider that when you are actually handling or dealing with human beings, so this category of unethical behavior sometimes can be categorized as, first of all, ignorance, because people are not aware that they are actually performing some unethical act. For example, they have certain information within or about a customer, and then they mistakenly share that information over the social media. Or perhaps they take a picture of their customer, but the customer didn't want the picture to be taken, and incidentally, the picture is being shared on their personal social media. Okay, that can be an example of ignorance behavior. And then, of course, in terms of by accident, people are prone to actually do something wrong because they are unaware. Okay, for example, uh, they are bringing their own devices to the workplace and accidentally they click on some uh, malware link, for example, and because they are using their personal computer and by accident they release the malware on the organization network because they are using their personal devices on company's network. That is an example of accidental behavior. And then third, of course, with clear intent, they want to cause harm. So this one is also very dangerous because they are inside your organization and they have clear intent to cause harm to whatever you are protecting. Okay, so you must have clear distinction between ignorance, accident, and intent, and you must have every inch of policy that covers these three categories of unethical behavior. So be clear about these three categories and you must be clear of how to properly write a policy and have proper mechanism to protect against these three categories of unethical behavior within your policy. So once you understand that three categories of unethical behavior, which is ignorance, accidental, and with intent, now you can properly plan for proper deterrence mechanism. And usually the proper deterrence or perhaps prevention mechanism is to have proper laws, policies, and technical controls to control actually those three unethical behavior. So this is where you need to actually get together with your team of experts that you have identified to actually see, okay, what type of policy can you write, what type of security control that you can have in terms of proper hardware and software to actually deter those three types of unethical behavior. So what are the options available to you? So you need to discuss further with your team on this matter. And also you look at what type of law can actually be enforced on these three type of behavior. So if people are ignorant, can you actually punish them by law? If people are actually causing certain incident accidentally, okay, how punishable are they within the scope of the law? And of course, if they have an intent, that is very straightforward, they are punishable. But you must be very clear on how you can go by with these three type of behavior and how can you deter or prevent this type of behavior from actually causing harm to your information asset. So this is where some organizations have a proper code of conduct, meaning they have proper policy or procedures that people within the scope of their organization must follow or act upon. Okay, so members are expected to follow certain rules, certain guidelines for certain handling of information. There are certain code of ethics that must be followed that can have certain positive effect and of course must follow the social norm. And of course, we must give this understanding that as security professional or people or employee of the organization, they are actually expected to follow this policy and procedures, okay, as a responsibility to the employers, okay, to the organization, and also following the laws of the society. So you must make people understand there are certain policies and procedures that must be followed as a conduct within the organization that they are belonging to. So as an organization, you must have social responsibility to protect your customer and also your employee and the asset that you have that is you deem very worthy to your company. So you must instill in your organization that there are moral values and code of conduct that must be followed. Okay, organization must be encouraged to be ethical towards their customer and also to the people that work for them. Okay, it's important for you to have this within your company or organization to ensure that people can trust your service and also your worker can be very dedicated to work in the long term. So in terms of being responsible, there are two things that you need to actually identify for the organization. First of all is the liability. Means that when you are providing service, there are certain liability or legal obligation from the organization towards the customer or perhaps the client that you are providing the service to. Okay, so this extends beyond criminal or contract law because this is actually between the organization and their customer. So what is their responsibility between these two parties? To make sure that your customer trusts your service and if anything happens, your company can be liable to certain action. Okay, and you must be clear on if, let's say, your employee, okay, act without the authorization and perform illegal or unethical act, okay, within the information that your client have actually trusted upon you. So what can be done to this wrongful action? Okay, what have you done to have proper liability should that thing happen? Can you protect against that action should your customer be exposed to that type of situation? So this you must also consider. Okay, so employer and employee must have way to be accountable when they are handling their customers' information, for example. So these are the liability aspect. And then the secondly is the due care. Okay, what has been done to ensure that whatever information that you have is properly protected. Meaning do care actually covers what action that you have to protect your asset and to protect your customers' interest. Okay, because if let's say certain cases happen, your do care, okay, will be looked upon. How far did you go to actually protect this asset from getting harmed? Okay, because you need to show, okay, that you have certain responsibility to protect the asset in the first place. So this is the two part, liability and due care. The next term is due diligence. So these are the valid efforts made by your organization to protect the asset that you deem worthy. So what have you done to ensure that your asset is protected, and how do you maintain that effort? Okay, it's not enough that you understand that you need to do this, but to what extent have you actually done to protect the asset, for example? And then jurisdiction. So how far does your copyright, for example, covers to protect your asset, for example? So how far does the policy covers to protect the user's interest or the customer's interest? Okay, so for example, nowadays, for example, in banks, you have PIDM to protect the customer's money. Let's say the bank went bankrupt, for example. So this covers the coverage of the bank and the monetary value of the customer. This can be an example of the jurisdiction of the policy coverage. How far does it cover? Okay, jurisdiction is very important. If let's say certain things happen, or can your actual policy and law be enforced within that jurisdiction? Okay, so for example, if you have copyrighted material, if let's say people is using it overseas, can your Copyright Protection Act actually protect your copyright material overseas as well as it is protecting it locally? So you must understand the extent of your copyrighted coverage. That is just an example. Okay, so the jurisdiction is also very important, meaning how far does the policy and law is protecting your asset. Other aspect to ensure that there are proper way that a customer or client can trust an organization service is that how do you actually provide or manage investigation within the organization. So for example, if certain wrongdoing happen, so what can organization do? So this is where it's very important from the very beginning or the start of the organization, you have proper investigation body or perhaps enforcement body to investigate certain wrongdoings or incident. So there must be individual responsible to investigate certain incident or action. So usually it will begin from internal investigation, and after enough evidence have been gathered, for example, then outside or third-party investigator can come in and do the investigation. But the most importantly, usually the investigation internally is done from the human resource department or perhaps involving higher up management. It is very important to identify this group of individuals or experts to perform the investigation based on your liability identification, your due diligence, and your jurisdiction of coverage based on the policy that you have beforehand to protect the asset that you need protecting. So when the incident happen, you can have a proper paper trail and a proper flow of investigation and people that is responsible to protect the asset and what have been done to protect the asset in the first place. So that every people is liable to responsibility, and there is certain way to actually verify what have you done in the first hand to protect this asset before the incident actually happened. So in terms of investigation, let's say there are certain complaints or that need to be performing certain investigation with regard to certain incident, so there must be a proper timeline for that investigation. Okay, ideally, the longest that you can have is perhaps within the 12 months after the incident happened. So investigation must be done properly and documented properly. So it is important to understand that most complaints should be dealt with within 6 months after the complaint has been received. So you must investigate each and every complaint or reports to make sure that your company will be held responsible or seen as responsible towards safeguarding your clients and any person who is involved in the incident. Okay, so after that, the disciplinary committee can impose perhaps a warning to the responsible party, or severe warning, suspension, expulsion, or perhaps fine. Okay, depending on the extent of the incident or what has happened to the asset that you are protecting. Of course, to understand or to identify what needs to be done, proper write-up or proper planning within certain jurisdiction of your policy and law coverage must be there in the first place. So before we go further to this last part of our lecture, okay, you can take 5-minute break and recap what you have learned so far within the scope of ethics in the organization. So part 6 is on the code of ethics. What is actually the code of ethics and who is actually covered and must follow this code of ethics? First of all, identify who is the information security professional. So simply put, people with your set of skills and your set of expertise are covered or identified as information security professional because you have the mastery of a particular set of information related skills or computer skills, for example, you have that capability, and also you have a common set of value, and then lastly you have a responsibility or duty to the community based on the skills that you have and the expertise that you have within this scope of community. So you are categorized as information security professional. So be proud of it and understand what comes to the responsibility of this group. As information security professionals, you must follow this set of code of ethics. So the objective of this code of ethics is to actually guide you to act responsibly, okay? Be responsible with the skills that you have and understand that this skill come with a responsibility to be good to the society and use that knowledge that you have for good. Okay, and also to provide a benchmark, okay, for self-evaluation. So what is good, what is bad, and what has been done with that knowledge as a whole. Third is to actually minimize problem with ethical behavior to encourage responsible behavior. So you must understand that you must actually do good with your skills to provide beneficial benefit to the community and organization that you serve with using your technical skills and that computer and information security knowledge. And then lastly, to help professionals identify and resolve ethical dilemmas. So let's say a certain incident happened, so you have a clear conscience and guide to how to act in this situation in order to perhaps provide solution to others, or perhaps how to actually act responsibility in those situations with the knowledge that you have and the skills that you have. Basically, the objective overall is how you use your skills that you have, your knowledge that you have to benefit whomever that is needed help or assistance with your skills and capability. Just like a policy that is written, so the same is with the maintenance of the code of ethics. So it's not enough that you have a code of ethics, so the code must be properly understood and particularly and commonly used taught, monitored, and regularly evaluated and revised. But usually the code of ethics, you must remember that it guides you to act responsibly with the skills that you have and with the technical know-how that you have within the scope of organization, and also responsibility to the society as a whole. So as information security manager, you must properly define. Usually you can actually define your code of ethics within the scope of your company or organization and tailor-make your code of ethics based on the norm within your organization. Okay, so any changes within the code of ethics, okay, must be agreed by the management. Okay, because you remember the top-down and bottom-up approach, usually it's more easier for the code of ethics, just like with anything, if it's being mandated by the management and disseminated to the whole organization. Okay, so the disciplinary committee that you have can recommend, okay, anything or any relevant behavior or acceptable behavior that is aligned with the code of ethics. And then secondly, by having a proper set of guidelines, so you are actually following or actually set a acceptable code of standard within the thing that must be followed by every people in your organization. Okay, and then of course the most important part is that, like anything else, because information and technology is always evolved, so does the code of ethics must be properly reviewed, okay, either annually or perhaps 2 years, depending on the importance on how fast technology is changing, on how actually community changes their behavior within one another. Because for example, okay, nowadays we are, for example, working from home, so there are certain extent, there are certain behavior that cannot be monitored directly. So how can you ensure that people actually being ethical while at the same time is far apart from each other? Okay, so because you are not physically there, so how can you ensure that people can be trusted even when they are far from you? So how can you ensure that there are proper recording of behavior and there are proper action that can be accountable for should certain incident happen? Okay, so the code of ethics is the guideline for that can be used for your organization and also for security professionals within your company. All right, so by that, I think that is the coverage of today's lecture. So I hope it has been beneficial to you and you can use this guideline to properly use this as a proper guideline to write your policy. Make sure that it's based on and can be supported by law and it is actually stringed together and supported by a common ethical value. So as a closing note, you must remember that information security covers a broad range of spectrum of people that is involved. It can either involve people physically, or it can involve people that is geographically separated, because technology have a certain way of reach nowadays. Okay, and also when you are writing a policy, it must be properly understood, practiced, and maintained to ensure that it's relevant to the thing that you are protecting and want to enforce. And then what is socially accepted and lawfully enforced can assist you to write a proper policy and assist you if, let's say, certain incident happen and you want to make sure that people follow through to this policy and understood and enable to enforce it properly. So the gist of this chapter is that you understand the role of law and the importance of ethics in order to form a proper policy to protect your information asset. Okay, so I hope this chapter has been beneficial to you and you can use this knowledge that you have today in order for you to be a proper and a very well-rounded information security professionals. So until the next time we meet, okay, thank you for following this lecture.